We begin first with the prophet Zephaniah. Zephaniah is usually dated to the 7th century. So when is the 7th century BC? Is that the 700s? Actually, the 7th century we know of as the 600s. So when it comes to centuries, we're in the 21st century. But what are the years? The 21st century means that we are in the 2000s. The same with the 7th century. Simply take that number down. That means it's in the 600s BC. During the 600s BC, we have the reforms of King Josiah. Do you remember what's happening with King Josiah? King Josiah is the one who decides to reform our people. All of the moral decline that we had seen under a previous king, Manasseh, Josiah is going to seek to reform our religion and our society so that all of us are worshiping the one God, Yahweh. So interestingly, Zephaniah is writing before the discovery of the scroll. The scroll is referred to as the Torah. Scholars debate whether that means all 5 books of the Torah. What are the first 5 books of the Bible? The Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible. What are the first 5 books of the Bible? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So it could be the case that it was all 5 books of the Torah that were discovered, or others suggest that it was simply the book of Deuteronomy that was discovered then. Which is interesting because when we read our Bible, where do we find that Torah, these first 5 books are found where? They're found in the beginning of the Bible. So we're led to believe that these first 5 books were written first, and then all the other books were written later, correct? What is this suggesting? That all those prophets that we talked about last class, and in the last 2 classes, that all of those existed before the Torah, and now suddenly the Torah is going to be discovered. Why do we say discovered in quotation marks? Because Josiah decides to take on a reform, and 5 years later, follow the story now, we're going to reform our society. 5 years later, when we're renovating the temple, what do we discover inside the temple wall? We discover God's word written down by Moses. How interesting that all these other prophets that we talked about last class, they had no reference to those first books of the Old Testament. They don't quote Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. Those books weren't around yet. So Josiah is reforming the kingdom. He sets out to reform the kingdom. 5 years later, we discover the words that Moses wrote down that he received from God in the scroll or the book of Deuteronomy.
When you say discover, you don't mean actually found. You mean we're now paying attention to it?
Notice. I guess so.
Excellent question. What I mean is that King Josiah and or those close to him are telling us that they found the book of Moses, and so in an age before carbon dating, did we know that whether it was written by Moses or not? I had no idea. We're not suggesting that it was some sort of religious fraud, that someone wanted to deceive another person. But obviously, as part of this religious reform, we wanted people to live a certain way, and by discovering words that Moses purportedly received from God, helped for us to be able to point back and say, look at what it says right here. We found something written by Moses, where Moses tells us how to live. What's the difficulty of the book of Deuteronomy we talked about 2 classes ago? Challenge is at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, it talks about Moses' death. If Deuteronomy was written by Moses, did he write about his own death? That would be problematic. Which is why most scholars come to the conclusion that this book that was discovered within the walls of the temple as being renovated was part of King Josiah's reform. How are we going to live as a people? Got good news for you. We have here words that God gave to Moses.
Isn't that what happens in every society? Sometimes we go too far and then we want to go back to basics.
There's definitely a pendulum shifting. So in terms of the context, let's take a look at what happened before Josiah, because why did Josiah feel that he had to reform our society and our religion? Let's trace it back to King Manasseh then. King Manasseh reigned for 40 years. During his 40 years, it was a horrifying thing for Zephaniah and others to see, because essentially they're seeing all of this corruption. If we turn to the second book of Kings, chapter 21, verses 1 to 11, it details what was happening under Manasseh's reign. How old was Manasseh when he became king? Verse 1? No way. We have another child king. 12 years old. When you're 12 years old, how much are you ruling the kingdom versus how much those closest to you are ruling the kingdom for you? He was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 55 years. His mother's name was Hephzibah. Why is that significant? Because the queen mother then, if you're a 12-year-old king, the one that's ruling is the queen mother. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. So essentially, all the things that, according to the stories of how we came out of Egypt, and we cleared this land of all of those people before us, now we're resorting to those things that they used to do. He rebuilt the high places his father Hezekiah had destroyed, meaning places where he had erected shrines to other gods. Hezekiah, his father, destroyed those shrines. What is Manasseh doing? Rebuilding those shrines. Why not curry the favor of other gods? Just in case Yahweh is not as powerful as we had hoped, why not have a few other gods in your corner? He bowed down to all the starry hosts and worshipped them, meaning he was not worshiping Yahweh. He was worshiping other gods, the heavens. He built altars in the temple of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, "In Jerusalem I will put my name." And in the 2 courts of the temple of the Lord, he built altars to all the starry hosts. Verse 6, what did he do when he got older and had his own child, of course? He sacrificed his own son. Did we sacrifice our children? Is that something that God said that we had to do? What comes after that? Anyone able to help us with verse 7?
The Asherah idol he had made, he set up in the temple of which the Lord had said to David and to his son Solomon, "In this temple and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I shall place my name forever."
Awesome. Verse 8. So he's setting up another image in our temple to Yahweh.
"I will not in future allow Israel to be driven off the land I gave their fathers, provided that they are careful to observe all I have commanded them, in the entire law which my servant Moses enjoined upon them. But they did not listen, and Manasseh misled them into doing even greater evil than the nations whom the Lord had destroyed at the coming of the Israelites. Then the Lord spoke through his servants the prophets, because Manasseh, king of Judah, has practiced these abominations and has done greater evil than all that was done by the Amorites before him, and has led Judah into sin by his idols. Therefore, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I will bring such evil on Jerusalem and Judah that, whenever anyone hears of it, his ears shall ring.
Let's stop right there. So that's essentially setting up the situation of what was happening. Did we believe that we had to kill our own children? No. That was something that other societies were practicing. And Manasseh, in order to win a military battle, decided, well, I'm hearing some voices telling me that if I sacrifice my son, we'll win in the battle. I hate to sacrifice my son, but winning that battle is more important too. Manasseh's reign was also filled with divination. What is divination? When people pretend to be able to predict the future. Pagan worship, the death of the innocent. And so we get this image of how it was that Manasseh was an evil king, and so when Josiah becomes king, his goal is to reform what had gone before them. So after these 70 years of silence that we've had since Proto-Isaiah, finally the 70 years, which is a long time in the ancient world, are shattered by the voice of Zephaniah. Zephaniah tells them that Judah, which is our territory in the south, must reject idolatrous practices, because if we don't stop worshiping these other gods, what's going to happen? God will destroy Judah, and God will destroy its capital city, Jerusalem. How's that for a happy message? Zephaniah is known as the literary father of Hebrew eschatology, simply meaning that he prophesied the end of time. The eschaton, fancy Greek word for the end of time. Eschatology is the study of end time. It was Zephaniah who believed that there's going to be a day when the world comes to an end. If you don't stop worshiping idols, The world will come to an end. God will destroy Jerusalem. God will destroy the temple. God will destroy Judah. And the end of the world will come. That day in which God would come and destroy the world, we've talked about before. Amos referred to it as the day of the Lord. Do you remember back to Amos? When he talks about on that day, what is he talking about? On that day when God steps in and does something about this situation. So Zephaniah imagined that on that day when God steps in, is it going to be a pretty scene? Is God going to be happy with us? Is it going to be a scene of destruction? So when we read books like Revelation in the New Testament, a lot of those terrifying images, where are they rooted? In a person like Zephaniah. The tone changes in chapter 3, verse 9, from death and destruction to the remaining remnant. So now there's a note of hope that even though all of this is going to be destroyed, Judah and Jerusalem and the temple, a remnant, meaning a small group, will survive and will be blessed by God. So even though the city of Austin will be destroyed, good news, a remnant will survive. We look around the room and we say, ooh, we hope that's us. Did Zephaniah write those words? Who knows? Some speculate that those later words of hope, because Zephaniah is such a prophet of doom and gloom, that maybe those later words of hope were actually added by someone else later who just didn't like the ending of that story. Would you like how this ends? Doom and gloom and God being angry at us all? What if we were to tag on another ending where there's a happier outcome for some of us? Zephaniah in Christian scriptures, do we read of Zephaniah in the New Testament? We see that the New Testament never mentions Zephaniah, but certain parts of his ideas, certain parts of his thought about this coming day of the Lord, and about how God being upset with us, we do see some of those thoughts reflected, for instance, in the book of Revelation. We're going to open up the book of Revelation. When God comes in the book of Revelation, God is not happy. God is, pissed. God is not happy. Shall we take a look at some of the words of the prophet Zephaniah? The text study for this prophet is chapter 1, verse 7, verses 12 to 17, and chapter 2, verse 3. It's his Day of the Lord passages. Zephaniah chapter 1, verse 7, "Be silent before the sovereign Lord, for the day of the Lord is near. The Lord has prepared a sacrifice. He has consecrated those who he has invited."
At that time I will explore Jerusalem with lamps. I will punish the men who thicken on their leaves, who say in their hearts, neither good nor evil can the Lord do. Their wealth shall be given to pillage, and their houses to devastation. They will build houses, but shall not dwell in them, plant vineyards, but not drink their wine. Near is the great day of the Lord, near and very swiftly coming. Hark, the day of the Lord, bitter than the warrior's cry. A day of wrath is that day, a day of anguish and distress, a day of destruction and desolation, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of thick black clouds, a day of trumpet blasts and battle alarm against fortified cities, against battlements on high. I will hem men in till they walk like the blind, because they have sinned against the Lord, and their blood shall be poured out like dust, and their brains like dung.
Ouch. How's that for a picture? Zephaniah's picture of what's going to happen on that day when God comes. It's going to be a day of wrath, and you're going to pay. So on that day, it's an unhappy day. The vineyards that we planted, don't worry about harvesting. We're not going to be the ones to harvest them. The homes that we built ourselves, not going to happen. It's a day of darkness and gloom and clouds covering the earth. Very much reminiscent of what we hear in Exodus when God appears. How does God appear? In cloud and with loud trumpet blasts. Those same images we're hearing in the prophet Zephaniah. Not a happy day.
I wonder why they don't give him credit for it.
So good question. If you're writing a New Testament book, do you want to quote a person like this and tell them this is how it all ends? Or do you want to come up with a different ending? What's the ending that Jesus comes up with? Very different ending. Of this God who, even though you've sinned and done wrong and turned your back, it's not going to be a God who comes in destruction. It's going to be a God who welcomes you home and embraces you. Whoa, think how radical that is. The prophet Zephaniah, one picture of God getting us a day of wrath. Jesus, whole different picture of a merciful God who, even though you've turned your back on God, so long as you are contrite, so long as you're repentant, God welcomes you home. Two very different pictures. Chapter 2, verse 3. Seek the Lord, all you humble of land, you who do what he commands. Seek righteousness, seek humility. Perhaps you will be sheltered on the day of the Lord's anger. If you want to avoid what's coming on that day, when God comes, what do you have to do? Zephaniah tells us, seek the Lord, you humble of heart, seek righteousness, and seek humility. Maybe there's a way to escape after all. Questions or comments about Zephaniah? Happy reading? Want to go home tonight and read Zephaniah? Just the images that Terry read to us previously. Their blood will be poured out like dust, their brains or their entrails, depending on the translation, like dung. In the same way that waste leaves the body, your entrails or your brains are going to be bashed out. They're going to leave the body as well. Yikes. That's an image of God coming with a big hammer and whapping you.